notes, let's turn to the notes. This is talk number 23, all right? Talk number 23. If you've missed a talk, you can go to inpathsofrighteousness.org and probably find something there. If you have your notes, I'm going to follow along in these notes. I didn't get a chance to edit them before I sent them out, and I have edited them for myself, and maybe you can edit them as you go along. A summary of the materials on punishing children for the sins of their fathers and first look at the bringer of justice motif. We'll get to that next week. So the sins of the fathers continued. Let me just remind you how we got into the sins of the fathers. The second commandment says that if you make a visual image of God, that He will then punish you and your children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. I think for anybody when they read that, that sounds like bad news from a lot of different points of view. The piece that's very disturbing is it sounds like God is unfair, doesn't it? And so I've tried to track for you two places so far. They're narrative, and that's why I put this in narrative context at Exodus 23, 32 through 34, which interrupts the discussion about the tabernacle, but actually in terms of time, apparently is at the same time as the giving of this. We had there the sin of the golden calf. And there's a lot of dialogue between God and Moses, and finally with Exodus 34, 6 and 7, we come to the climax. And God says, I am loving, I am kind, I am long-suffering, I am slow to anger, I will forgive. But then He also goes on to say, and I will punish the children to the third and fourth generation. But He's turned the thing upside down because in this piece, it has to do with punish first and then love. But when you get over here, it turns upside down love, which is expanded, and punish remains the same. The same thing happens here later at Kadesh Barnea. They're halfway to the promised land, and here they rebel because the spies bring them a report and then put a wrong spin on it. We're not able to go in and take this good land. And they rebel, they are unbelieving. And again, the second commandment is quoted, and again it's quoted this way, except this time Moses quotes God and rehearses this same sort of thing. So it's a very interesting case of an intra-biblical use of texts. It's not the first time we've seen this, because Genesis 12, the promise, gets picked up and repeated by various people and changed and amplified and manipulated. But this is the first time we see this happening to the law. And then, today we're going to be in Deuteronomy chapter 5. The second commandment, of course, is given again. And then I'm going to look at 3 or 4 pieces where within Deuteronomy itself, in one way or the other, it reflects on that idea of punishing the children for the sins of the fathers. Now, I hope you haven't grown weary in well-doing with this. I will come back after we turn the camera off and say a few other things and take questions. But let's just look at the notes and let me get you started. This talk quickly surveys the texts from Deuteronomy that relate to the issue of punishing children for the sins of the fathers. So that's the focus. A lot of other things that could be talked about, but I'm just focusing on the question of judgment, and is it just? Is the judgment of God just? How do we understand that? The Deuteronomy talks are given on the 40th year after leaving Egypt. And if you have your Bibles open to Deuteronomy, that'll be helpful. Let me invite you to turn with me to Deuteronomy. I'm going to spend the next 8 or 9 months seeing if I can't master the book of Deuteronomy, or put more appropriately, seeing the book of Deuteronomy can't master me, all right? That is the right way around, isn't it? I would say of all the books of the Old Testament, except for Isaiah and Psalms, it's Deuteronomy that really is the crucial book. And these three books, Isaiah, Deuteronomy, and Psalms, are the ones that guide the early church. These are the ones they go and look to. 80% of all the quotations come from these books. And Jesus sees himself clearly through the lens of Isaiah, quoting Deuteronomy to make sense out of his life. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 5, east of the Jordan in the territory of Moab, Moses began to expound this law. So if you know where Jericho is, he's on the other side of Jordan in the territory of Moab. They've not crossed over yet. And there he expounds the law that's been given. Now, they're given to a new generation of the children of the fathers. The fathers, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb and Moses, are all dead. And so the book of Deuteronomy and the passages we're going to read come to a new generation. And I think that may help to explain why we see some changes in the way the text works. What is striking in this Mosaic review of history is that he rehearsed in some detail both the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea, which was originally told in Numbers 13 and 14, and the golden calf incident of Exodus 32 through 34. So we'll see those, and we'll work on them very briefly. But Deuteronomy repeats these two stories. Now, what's interesting is when it repeats those stories, both times it completely drops out the second commandment and the expansion of it. And you want to say, Moses, why did you do that? I mean, this is important for my theology of justice. Why did you drop those out? And of course, arguments from omissions are very difficult, aren't they? Why did she fail to say something to me? Maybe she had indigestion, you know? Maybe it's not that she's fallen out of love. Maybe there's a perfectly good explanation. She has a stone in her shoe, huh? But we don't know why Moses dropped out. But he leaves out any direct reference to Exodus 34, 6, and 7, which deals with the sins of the fathers being visited upon the children. Moses also gives a further interpretation of the second commandment, which contains the sins of the fathers assertion. We'll come to that, Deuteronomy 7. And at the very end of his speeches, he reminds this new generation that they will be punished only for their own sins. Deuteronomy 24:16, and we'll look at that also. Such talk of breaking the covenant, frequent rebellions, 10 times, is mentioned in Numbers, and the constant talk of the anger and wrath of God bring to the surface the question about the future of Israel. If God's going to judge them, and they're going to sin, and God's going to judge them, and they're going to sin, and God's going to judge them, doesn't God finally get tired and say, I've had it. I've had it. This is it. No more patience, no more long-suffering with Israel. What about the future for Israel? Moses speaks to the new generation about this in Deuteronomy 4, just before the restatement of the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy 5, and at the very end of his life in the so-called Song of Moses, which might also be called the Song of the Lord, the bringer of justice, because the song is all about the Lord's working justice, mainly vengeance, in the future. Now, I'm not going to take time today or the next session to look at those passages, but they're fascinating because it's Deuteronomy 4 and especially Deuteronomy 32 with their talk about disobedient Israel, the judgment, the justice of God, the mercy of God, and how that works out in the future. These passages actually say, you're going to be so bad that I'm going to send you into exile. And yet, I'm going to bring you back from exile. I mean, that's hundreds of years away, isn't it? I mean, we're standing here at, depending on how you date this, 1400 or something like that, and the Exodus doesn't happen until 587. So this is hundreds of years away, and the return is another 100 years So Moses is talking way down in the future how the justice of God and the mercy of God, and these are really the elements we want to hang on to, how the justice of God and the mercy of God work together. And Deuteronomy 4, and especially Deuteronomy 32, put us on that path. Much, much later, when Paul is dealing with his central question, which for Paul, reading inside the story, is not justification by faith. That may have been the central question for Martin Luther, but that was not the central question for Paul. The central question for Paul was the Gentile question. How do you get the Gentiles in without making Jews out of them? And the answer is justification by faith. But then the question is, and then what happens to Israel? I am an Israelite. The covenant and the promises were given to Israel. Has Israel stumbled? Absolutely. Are they flat on their face and are they out for the count of 10? Well, we'll have to read Romans 9, 10, and 11, which are sort of an exegesis of Deuteronomy 4 and 32. So the things that we're learning in this class, I know they're not New Testament, right? We don't even know there is a New Testament. In fact, there is no New Testament until the 2nd century, right? Paul never talked about a New Testament. But the things we're learning in this class from Scripture, Paul's only Bible, when Paul deals with the church, it's these texts that give substance to Paul's theology and give meaning to Paul's theology. Well, I hope you go home and buy an Old Testament after that advertisement. Yeah, I'm always a little chagrined when people have a New Testament and Psalms in their pocket. That's not really the Bible, is it? Perhaps an outline of Deuteronomy would be helpful. Wright, one of the commentators, observes that dividing up Deuteronomy is like slicing a fruit cake. One can do it a number of different ways because the cake is so rich, and quite frankly, no matter how you slice a fruit cake, it tastes good, so maybe it's not too important. Most commentators acknowledge there's probably 3, maybe 4, and the thing to hang on to here is everybody agrees that in the book of Deuteronomy you have Moses speaking. These are speeches. The bookends of Deuteronomy are narratives. But between those narrative bookends you have 3, depending a little on how you divide it up, maybe 4 big speeches. So it's Moses speaking to us about the law of God. And I'm not going to try to elaborate on the outline at this stage. We'll come back to that sometime later. Remember those who heard these sermons by Moses, who is now 120 years old, are the children of Caleb and Joshua who have grown up in the wilderness, suffering the consequences of their parents' sins. This may shed a bit of light on some of the text which we shall be considering. Now, very briefly, Deuteronomy 1, 19 through 46, the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea rehearsed, and I only want to really look at one piece in this because the story is fairly straightforward. So if you have Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 19, then as the Lord our God commanded us, we set out from Horeb and went toward the hill country, and they arrived there. And they send out spies, verse 23. It seemed good to me to send out the spies. The spies come back, verse 26. But you were unwilling to go up because the spies said you can't do that. It's too difficult. And you rebelled against the Lord, against the Lord's command. You grumbled, verse 27, in your tents. And here's the little piece I want to pick up. And you said, and we're not told this in the first telling of the story, which is Numbers 13, 14. But in this telling, Moses says, you said, the Lord hates us. Now, the reason why I'm stopping on that is because the second commandment says, I will punish the children to the 3rd and the 4th generation of those who hate me. And if you look at the notes, a little bit of careful connecting here. I've given you the quotation. We have already noted that the use of nakwa, which is translated, he does not leave the guilty unpunished, forms a clear link to the same term, nakwa, in the 3rd commandment, about verbal misrepresentation. He will not hold the guiltless, the nakwa, guiltless. So when Israel says the Lord hates us, when in fact the Lord loves Israel, this shows that Israel is breaking not only the second commandment by making a golden calf, but in the rebellion at Kadesh is also breaking the third commandment because they're saying something about God that's not true. The text says very clearly, the Lord loves you. The people at Kadesh Barnea stood it on its head and they said, the Lord's brought us out here because He hates us. And so we have a very clear connection back to not only the second commandment, but also to the third commandment, and underscores what was going on there. Now, we'll hold on to that because a little later on we'll see this hates business and pick that up. But I just note that for you. The last paragraph on this page, we pause here to observe that the key to the people of God, both corporately and individually, going ahead with the purpose of God to establish a great and holy and just society, is trust in the Lord. So as they're out in the desert and going along for 40 years here and eventually coming into the land, their posture and their attitude here is one of unbelief, one of lack of faith, and it delays God. Can God be delayed? Absolutely. Can He be delayed forever? Apparently not. But they do faith. So the right response of God's children to God's program of building a just society is to have faith in God's promise. And if you'll hold on to that till next week, I'll come back and I'll put that and other key terms like mercy and loving kindness into a larger model and see if we can't connect them and make some sense of them. Now page 2, and let us turn to the text I want to work on. Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 9. Chapter 5 is the giving of the Ten Commandments. Chapter 6, the most important thing, is teach your children. Chapter 6 is all about primary socialization, one of the basic maintenance mechanisms. Chapter 7, which I will not read to you, tells them to go into Canaan, show the people no mercy, and to kill them. That's another maintenance mechanism, harem, the destruction. We'll talk about that later. It also says don't intermarry with them, which is a little bit nonsensical. If you kill them, you can't marry them. But Moses knows that they're not going to kill them all, and they're going to try to marry some of them. And Judges chapter 3, verse 4 and 5 says they did exactly that. So they were not to marry them. That's the practice of endogamous marriage, to marry within the clan. So you've got 3 maintenance mechanisms right up front. Teach your children, primary socialization. Kill off all the heathen when you go into the land, harem. And don't marry them, endogamous marriage. And there are 2 or 3 more, such as Sabbath and cleanness, which we'll come to by and by. At the end of that passage, verse 7, he says, this is the context then, the Lord did not set His affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than the other people, for you were the fewest of all people. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath He swore to your forefathers, that would be Abraham, that He brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of the Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Verse 9, know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God. And it's interesting, that word faithful, it's the only time it's used here in reference to God in the Bible. It's a rather odd Hebrew term. I don't know quite how it got there, but there it is. Now look at this. Keeping His covenant of love. And we'll come back and talk about that. The phrase covenant of love is only used twice in the Pentateuch, here and a little later in verse 12. Now let me ask you, do you hear something? Keeping His covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love Him and keep His commandments. Do you hear an echo? This is the second commandment. I will love people to the thousands, and you don't know in reading the second commandment whether it's thousands of people or thousands of generations. This text finally tells us it's thousands of generations, which is a very long time, especially when you contrast it punishing to the 3rd and 4th generation. It's 250 to 1. And I presume that's the point. So here we have a very clear echo reference to the second commandment. Now you would expect, having talked about love to the thousands of generation, then he would also say, as it does indeed say, here and here and here and here. So the four other references before, the two Ten Commandment versions and the version at the Golden Calf and the version at Kadesh Barnea, all four of these, when they deal with the second commandment, they say, to the thousands, love, and then to the third and fourth generation, punishment. Now the author of Deuteronomy knows this. But look what he does with the text. I'm going to back up now and read verse 9. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is a faithful God. That's a new touch. Keeping his covenant of love. Putting the two words covenant and love together is a new touch. To 1,000 generations. The word generation is used here for the first time in connection with 1,000 and spelling out very clearly where this is going and echoes very clearly the second commandment. Who love him and keep his commandments. That's also out of the second commandment. But, verse 10, and what you would expect is, but he punishes the children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. He's already said that before, hasn't he? But he changes it. He changes it. I don't know what else you could say. Look at verse 10. But those who hate him. Now the little word hate him is still vocabulary taken out of the second commandment. You know, I will punish those people to the third and fourth generation who hate me. Those who hate him will be repaid, and the English translation here I will work on with you, to their faces by destruction, says the NIV. He will not be slow to repay to their faces, says the NIV. Now hold on to that. Those who hate him. Therefore, take care to follow the commandment, the decree, and the law I give you today. Now, if you have your notes, I'd like for you to look at these with me. Page 2, I've gone through and tried to ask how and where, and then the really difficult question, why, has Moses changed, upgraded, altered, modified the text? All right? As an evangelical, I'm not able to say, got it wrong, or created a contradiction, which of course wouldn't be Moses, but some later editor who didn't really know what he was doing. That's the easy way out, and almost to a person, and I started to say a man, and I'm afraid they all are men, they take that way out in the liberal commentaries. But as an evangelical, I'm stuck with the text, and I say that politely, all right? And you're stuck with it too. I take the text at face value, and I've got to make sense out of it. It's like, you know, my wife has one of these puzzles, you know, black pieces, you flip them over the white pieces, about 15 pieces, cut different shape, you put them, you got to do it. She's the only person I've ever seen do it. I don't even try, huh? But, you know, my answer is get a hacksaw. You know, make the pieces fit, you know. But as an evangelical, I'm not allowed to pull out my liberal hacksaw and cut off and say, that's late, this wasn't Moses, mistake here. No, I've got to look at the thing and say, I don't see how they go together. All right? And so it's really quite a difficult task to put them together, and I'm not going to pretend to have put it all together, but I'm trying. So I've laid side by side in your notes Deuteronomy 5:9, the second commandment, with Deuteronomy 7:10. And I've taken verse 10 before verse 9 because this passage, like the other passage in Deuteronomy, inverts it. That is, in the commandment, it's punish then love. But in these, it's love and punish, and this one puts love first and then puts punish second, which in itself, as we've already discussed, is significant. Now I want to look at some of the closer pieces. He's obviously dropped out, you shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. and has inserted a different saying about God. I don't know why. He has retained punishing the children for the sins. He's retained the idea of punishing, but he's dropped the idea of for the sins of the fathers. So what you have in the place of it is, but those who hate him, and that phrase does occur in an earlier version of the second commandment in Exodus, but not in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And then you have, he will repay to their faces by destruction. And then we have, he will not be slow. And if you are fast yourself this morning, you'll remember that in Exodus he says, slow to anger. But here he says, he will not be slow. Oh, I'll save that for a while. All right, we'll come back. To repay to their face, and I've inserted the RSV translation, his face here, which is the right reading, actually. And then you get this final addition, know therefore that the Lord your God is God, which apparently is the substitution for a jealous God. He is the faithful God, that's a new addition. Keeping covenant of love, that's an expansion of love, linking love with covenant. To 1,000 generations, he's added that word. So, now page 3, if you're following along. I realize this is a little bumpy and a little difficult. So I'm asking the question, here you have the second commandment in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and here you have it reworked, and he's dropped out the troublesome words to the third and the fourth generation. Do you see that? And it's the only time of the 4 times that we have this, 5 counting this one, here and here and here and here, but not here, Deuteronomy 7. 4 times out of 5, the words to the third and the fourth generation occur in the text. Here he drops those words out, but he's still clearly working with that text. And I suppose that he's trying to tell us something about them. Now on page 3, I've gone through and given you the NIV translation, the RSV translation, the NRSV translation, and at the top of page 4, just to keep the confusion higher, on a higher level, I've given you the literal rendering by a Jewish scholar himself, Levinson. Let me read you Levinson's translation at the top of page 4. And you can see that in all these, they've tried to do this sort of thing. A, B, C, C, B, A, where the A's correspond, the B's correspond, and the C's correspond. And there is a sense of poetry. And if you're looking at your NIV Bible, you will see that verse 10 is put into a different pagination than the verse before it and afterwards, right? Which is NIV's way of signaling to its readers, this is poetry. Now you understand that's an interpretation of the NIV translators. It doesn't show up that way in the Hebrew text, of course. But taking that, poetry, and saying, and how does the poem work? Poetry in Hebrew never rhymes. Hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up, you know what, right? Nope, no clock in Hebrew. You say something and then there's different ways of repeating it. But Hebrew poetry doesn't rhyme, which makes it, of course, very translatable. So at the top of page 4, let me read this to you. A, who requites. B, those who reject him to their faces. Now he retains that. C, by destroying them, but literally it's him. C, he does not delay. B, with anyone who rejects him to his face. C, he requites him. All right? Now, let's take a breath and let me read you the paragraph and see if we can make the point. Note that both the Revised Standard Version and Levinson's rendering have to his face and not to their face. The individual is in focus in the repaying. All right? So it's the individual that's being repaid, not a group. He's repaying them to his face. Now let's ask our question. Why the omission of to the third and fourth generation? It should be there. It's there all the other times. There is no easy way to get to an answer for such a question. Perhaps the reality that this second generation of children, the sons of Joshua and Caleb, and of those who died in the desert, have already been suffering the consequences of the sins of the fathers, and therefore they do not need to be told that sinning has consequences for the children to the third and fourth generation. I think that's a possibility. These people already know that. So why tell them again? You told it to the first generation. You said, now look, be careful what you do because, and I don't need to say this to any of you that are parents, do you? Be careful what you do because and we call them mistakes, don't we? Your mistakes will be visited on your children to the third and fourth generation, right? And if I gave you a piece of paper and said, would you mind listing the things that your parents did that harmed you? There's not a person in this room who couldn't fill up the page. And I had good parents, very good parents, right? That's just the way it is. So he's telling those parents, be careful what you do. Well, now the kids have already suffered for the children, as children for their parents' decision, and perhaps he doesn't repeat it because they already know about this. They are part of it. All right? If this second generation had children of their own, that would be Joshua's grandchildren, they too would have been suffering at least for a short period in the desert. So we're down to the third generation. What this second and perhaps third generation need to know is that if they themselves sin, the Lord will repay them, each one to his own face, and that the Lord will not delay or be slow in doing this. So I think that what is being said here, and I'll pick this up and repeat it again a little bit later, is that this passage says very carefully what it means when I say I will punish the children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation is that the consequences of the sins of the fathers will ripple down and have effect on the children. But the way sin works in judgment is if you sinned, you will be judged. That's the point of to his face. If you sinned, you will be judged. And so it underscores that principle that one suffers for their own sins, suffer in the sense of being punished for it. All right, now there's some additions to the text. There's actually 7 additions. There's a change from repay to punish, or from punish to repay. I don't think that's a major change. But there are 6 others. To their face 2 times, or to his face, see translation, or to his face, both times in the Hebrew. And this is just what I said, so let me read it to you. The rendering of the Hebrew pronouns is confusing, and I'm sorry about that. I don't want to start a discussion about Bible translations, but I hope that when you read the Bible, you will read at least 2 or 3 translations so that you will be confused on a higher level, right? Yeah. You don't have any need to really examine the text carefully until you get 3 or 4 different readings of the text, right? So it's very helpful. And I must say, although I have the NIV and I use the NIV, I get very annoyed with the NIV because the NIV is much more paraphrastic than literal and oftentimes puts you on the wrong path. So, just an off-stage comment about Bible interpretation. The rendering of the Hebrew pronouns is confusing. The correct rendering should be his in both cases, that is, to his face. The object of punishment is the individual who rejects and hates him. And we heard that echo in that first story there. Some take this as a radical reworking of the second commandment. Now this would be the sort of liberal way out. This is Levinson and others. But it can also be taken as an interpretation of the commandment to make clear that the commandment does not mean that a child is directly punished for the sins of the father, although they may suffer the consequences of the sins of the father. Right? I hope you didn't blink, because that's the class in a nutshell, right? And what I think is happening here with Deuteronomy 7 is that Deuteronomy 7 is interpreting for us the second commandment. Because apparently the author of Deuteronomy realizes that if you're not careful, you'll misunderstand the second commandment. So he deliberately inserts here, and at the very end of Deuteronomy, an interpretation. And he has already inserted these two narratives here, from which we learned a good deal about how these second commandments do work. And we'll rehearse that at the end of class today, if we have time. So there's just been a lot of interpreting and understanding and nuancing of how that second commandment actually works. And you might say, wow, what an enormous waste of time to keep talking about the second commandment again and again and again. Hey, for the next 1,000 years, the central problem for Israel is going to be the first, second, and third commandment, which actually all blend together. It's all about idolatry. Now, we will get to the oppression of the poor, commandments 4 through 10, in due course. They're certainly there, and they're extremely important. But what wrecks Israel is its inability to get right commandments 1, 2, and 3. And so to continually come back and to sharpen and to focus and to nuance this and tell stories about it is very important, and we're certainly far, far from being done with the second commandment and the first and the third. Furthermore, this phrase, to his face, helps us understand the scope of the punishment. That is, at least I think it does, one person, his face, is not punished for the sins of another person, some sort of corporate punishment. Now, I don't want to lean too heavily on that text, but I think it probably leans to that he's not only dealing with transgenerational punishment. Does the punishment of one generation transfer to another? The answer is no, not in a judicial sense. Do the consequences of the sins transfer from one generation to another? Yes. Now, does the punishment of one sin transfer corporately to the group? So we're going sideways, not this way. And we'll come very quickly to the classic story of Achan. Achan steals the Babylonian wedge, and the whole family gets killed, right? So what do you do with that? How do you handle corporate solidarity, or whatever label you want to put on it? And I think this verse at least gives us something to think about. I don't think it puts all the pieces together, but it at least gives us something to think about along those lines. He will suffer for his own sins. Again, we need to remind ourselves of the emphasis on all Israel and the whole congregation in Numbers 13 and 14. That will help us understand the corporate punishment. The reason why all Israel suffered the punishment of denial of entry into land is because all Israel sinned. Do you follow that? The reason why they were all kept out is not because 2 or 3 did poorly. I mean, didn't you used to hate the school teacher in the 4th grade when they said, all right, Judy and Sam were disobedient, everybody put their head down. Oh, hey, what, me? Why should I put my head down? I never do anything wrong. I mean, corporate punishment, right? And I know you teachers don't do that today. But, but in this text, it's all Israel, the whole congregation. They rebel against God. The exceptions are Joshua and Caleb. And the whole congregation rebel. The whole congregation are punished for their own sin. That makes sense? Now, you could talk about Joshua and Caleb and what happens to them. Now, let's take up the next little addition. He will not be slow to repay. This will catch the ear of the listener of the Pentateuch. They didn't read it. I just want to remind you of that, all right? They didn't read it. There was no Pentateuch to be read. I mean, there was only one copy, and you took care of it very carefully. This will catch the ear of the listener. It was a read document. It's an auditory society of the Pentateuch, because Exodus 34:6 and Numbers 14:18, which also are interpretations of the second commandment, this will catch the ear of the listener because she, and I've used the she there because the women are all there along with the children, because she will hear that God is slow to anger. Exodus and Numbers speak of, she will hear that God is not slow to anger. I left out a not here. Exodus and Numbers speak of slow to anger, whereas Deuteronomy speaks of not slow to repay. I left out the not. You'll insert that, please. All right? So we've got an interesting piece here. These two passages say slow to anger. This one says he's not slow to repay. So is God slow or not? Is God slow or not? Make up your mind, Moses. You know, tell us one way or the other, is God slow or not? Well, turn to page 5 at the top. Right? I mean, I'm not really sure what the answer is, but we'll read what page 5 at the top says. The slow to anger in Exodus 34 and Numbers 14 is attached to the lengthy statement about the love of God and not to punishment. Now, I don't know if that really solves it or not. And God did endure Israel, testing him 10 times before his anger came. So I suppose the real problem here is that God's idea of slowness is not our idea of slowness. I guess the text will push us that way. And it takes God 10 times, which may just be a metaphor for very, very often, 10 times before God really comes down upon them and punishes them. So he is slow to anger. But then he does punish them. So it did come. The second generation, that is Joshua's children, and perhaps the third generation, Joshua's grandchildren, will understand that the judgment upon the first generation, Joshua's generation, came immediately. Now we're going to try to figure out the time reference of judgment. Came, and don't you often ask, why doesn't the Lord come back and judge all these bad people? Huh? All right, well, now, we're going to deal with it here. It's interesting. When does judgment come? The children, Joshua and his children, and perhaps even the grandkids, although they're quite small, they would understand that the judgment of God came immediately upon the 10 spies. They were dead. The plague got them. They were simply taken out. Whether it was a day or 2 days or 3 days, they were gone. There was no slowness about that. They died of the plague. And they will also know that Joshua's generation suffered, and they did not go directly into the land, which was about a 2 weeks journey, but were out for 40 years. So what can you say about the punishment for those who were not the core, the 10 people who really rebelled and set it up wrong? What about the other people who were influenced by this? They didn't experience immediate death. They experienced over a 40-year period denial of entry into the land. So I don't know if that really helps me. Is God slow to anger or is he not? I'm not sure. But reading the story, there is a certain slowness, isn't there? I mean, sometimes he waits till they've rebelled 10 times. But then when the spies come back and they rebel, that's the end, right? When they're up here, when Moses is up on the mountain and he comes down and they made the golden calf, he says to the Levites, everybody who's with God over to me, put on your sword, go through the camp, and everybody who's been rebellious, and we're not told how they figured that out. Did they have name tags that said, me, I'm rebellious? You know, had they taken the earrings off? I mean, what was the sign? But anyhow, they figured that out. They went through the camp, and immediately, 3,000 people were put to the sword, right? So can the judgment be quick? Yes. Can the judgment take time? Yes. Yeah. Now, the rest of the bits and pieces I've talked about, I don't think I need to bother your head with here. Let's just skip down and make sure we got the other pieces in place. Deuteronomy 9:7 through 10:11 is the golden calf incident is rehearsed, and I don't find anything in there that is strikingly different than what you already have. So I'd like to turn to the very last text I want to take up, and that's Deuteronomy 24:16. At the more or less close of the giving of the law, it's not quite the end, but it's pretty close, you have sort of a grocery list of commandments. They do have some coherence in that they all seem to be about protecting marginal people. And I'm just going to break in and read the text and not try to work out all the literary context for you. I'm not sure that really helps us. Verse 16 says, "Fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their fathers." Right? And then the punchline, each is to die for his own sin. This is just what we read back in Deuteronomy 7. He will repay each to his own face. Right? So here's a very clear statement. Now, it appears, if you're talking about the death penalty here, and that's what they're talking about, fathers will be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their fathers. So if it's a death penalty, it's undoubtedly a court case, it's a judicial setting, and in a court case, in a judicial setting, you're very careful in inflicting the death penalty. The only people who receive the death penalty are the people themselves who committed the crime. So it's a very clear, open-faced statement of how this works in a court setting. Now, I don't think that this passage, the second commandment, is limited to a court setting. You could bring it into a court setting and use it, but it's broader than a court setting, and therefore the talk there about punishing children to the third and the fourth generation is not so much a court setting as it is a setting of general morality and how things work out. But this court setting piece is important. And I step outside the story for a second. It's interesting that this particular piece is quoted verbatim in Kings. Now, I haven't given you the reference, and I will try to send you some updated notes, and you'll have the reference there. But it is given verbatim in, I think it's 1 Kings. I forget the reference now, but it's one of the kings. And when he becomes king, people had murdered his father, and he finds the people who had murdered his father, and he puts them to death. But then he says very carefully, don't put to death their children. And then he quotes this passage. Do you see that work? And I'll give you a string of references where in the book of Kings, they did put to death the children when a new king came in. I mean, we're not used to that in America. I mean, the Republicans come in, the Democrats all go home, the Democrats come in, the Republicans, but we don't put them to death. But, you know, in most places where you have a change of monarch, I mean, we're one of the few places that doesn't do it quite like this. When you have a change of government, there's a lot of gunfire, a lot of hanging, a lot of killing. And you don't just kill the papa, who's been part of the problem, you kill his boys. Right? I mean, this is a pretty relevant sort of discussion, isn't it? We won't mention any names, but you know how the story goes. And the Bible says, no, you kill the person who's worthy of death, but you don't put the rest of the people to death. And the kings, in the book of Kings, understand that. At least Joash understood that and does that sort of thing.